So around 1652, the mid-1600s, the Dutch East India Company had established a trading post on the southern tip of Africa they called the Cape of Good Hope. Now, some Dutch sailors had been shipwrecked and landed in what is currently or today is Cape Town, and they'd been rescued, and they reported back to the company in Holland of the favourable conditions of the local people and the terrain for growing vegetables. So the Dutch East India Company, under a fellow called Jan van Riebeek, established a trading post in current-day Cape Town, with the idea being that ships on the way to India that were rounding the Cape of Good Hope could stop and resupply with vegetables, fresh fruit, vegetables, water, and that type of thing. Now, the original Dutch inhabitants and colonists encountered a people they called the Hottentots. Today, those people are called the Khoisan. They were a small, light-skinned people somewhat related to the Bushmen of the Kalahari. And they had been pushed down that direction from the invading African Negroid tribes that had been slowly migrating from the centre of Africa down southwards. So the black African tribes that we know, the Zulus and the Xhosa, the Sotho, they hadn't been in Africa or that part of Africa all that long. In some cases, they'd been there hundreds of years, but they hadn't, as at that stage, reached the Cape Colony. The Xhosa, which was the tribe Nelson Mandela came from, they had stopped settlement along a border called the Fish River. So the Dutch colonists set up market gardens, and they grew vineyards, and they started to build some of that classic Dutch architecture that you still see in places like Stellenbosch around the Cape. Now, they took on these Hottentots, which they might have referred to as indentured labour. They began to get the Hottentots to work for them, sometimes under duress, but they preferred to adopt them almost like parts of the family, and to teach them Christianity, and to speak Dutch, and to wear Western clothing. These original settlers were adherents to the Dutch Reformed Church, which is initialed as the NGV in South Africa. Now, they were very religious people. They were Calvinists, and they continued to expand in all directions from the original trading post. Now, at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, there was some danger that the French were about to overrun the lowlands, which would have been Belgium and Holland, and so the English took ownership or protection of the Cape of Good Hope, with the intention to protect it from the French seizing it. Now, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Dutch government and the English came to an arrangement that the English would keep that colony, and it became a British colony. Now, this created conflict with the original Dutch settlers, who had begun to clash with the Xhosa on the Fish River in a series of engagements. There were 8 or 10 wars of the Fish River against these black African tribes, as both were looking to expand, and cattle and land. The English, they began to bring in English settlers and farmers. And also around this time, there was an influx of settlers from France. They were called the Huguenots. The Huguenots were subjects of religious discrimination in France, and they fled, and many of them came to South Africa, and you can still see a lot of those French-sounding names in South African surnames even today. The British made English the official language of the new colony, and they outlawed the use of Dutch in government services and the teaching of Dutch in schools. And this caused great consternation for the Dutch settlers, who were now beginning to call themselves Boers. A Boer is a farmer. Of concern to the Dutch were also the slavery prohibition that was being introduced throughout the English colonies. Now, the Dutch didn't consider that their servants were slaves, but it was being put under scrutiny by the English authorities, which is the cause for what became the Great Trek, or the Voortrekkers. Now, the Voortrekkers were families and communities of Dutch and Boer, Dutch or Boer settlers who wanted to get away from English control. The boundaries of the Cape Colony were roughly defined as what might be the Cape Province today. There was plenty of land which was, to their mind, unoccupied. Of course, it was occupied by African tribes, and the African tribes that lived in those lands were militant and prepared to fight to defend their lands. But the Boers were prepared to head north. They believed that God had given them permission to find a land where they could practice their religion and their form of Christianity with God's protection. So groups of them began to leave the Cape Colony in wagons, something like the American settlers heading west in those days with the covered wagons. Now, the groups of the Boers were sometimes 200 or 300, families, children, women, and they made their way, some of them in an easterly direction, northeast to what would become Natal, where the Zulus lived, and others went directly north up through what would become the Orange Free State, over the Orange River, and others still kept going, and they crossed into the Vaal, which became the Transvaal. Vaal is a river. Now, all along the way, they wherever they found suitable grazing, small pockets of the Boers may settle and establish farms and say that that was as far as they wanted to go. As long as they were outside of the British sphere of influence, they were prepared to set up and make a living there. Now, a young Paul Kruger was to become the president of the Boer Republic of the Transvaal and to fight the British. As a young boy, at the age of 10, him and his family and community fought a pitched battle against one of these African tribes where the Boers formed a laager. They put their wagons in a circle, and the young Paul Kruger loaded the rifle and handed it to the men, where a small group of Voortrekkers fought off a large group of impi, or warlike Africans. Now, the Voortrekkers, or the Boers that travelled across to Natal, ran into the Zulus, and initially they made some treaties with the Zulus where they were to be given land in exchange for helping the Zulu king to subdue one of the tribes that were causing trouble in the area, and to retrieve some stolen cattle for the Zulu king. In exchange for this, they were to be given land. The Zulu king, however, had other ideas and set up a trap and ended up slaughtering around 80 of the Boer leaders, the men, and then sent his army, his impi, out to slaughter the men and women and children of the Boers that were waiting for their leaders to come back from this meeting that they were trapped and slaughtered in. They call that, the Afrikaners call this the Night of Tears, where the Zulus ran through the camps and killed many women, children, and Boers until the Boers could regroup and protect themselves. This created in them, in the Boers, distrust of the black African nations. Now, those Boers left Natal because that didn't work for them, and they migrated north. The South African Boer War Memorial at Forbes, New South Wales. The monument commemorates those from the district who died in service or were killed in action during the South African War. A handsome memorial lamp has been erected at the intersection of Lachlan and Templar Streets to commemorate the names of soldiers from this district who fell in the South African War. Colonel Waddell, Commandant of New South Wales, arrived yesterday to unveil the memorial, and in the presence of a large concourse which included the Light Horse, members of the Fire Brigade and citizens, after an impressive speech, performed the ceremony. The memorial is a handsome structure that was gratuitously designed by Mr. J.H. Bates and has been erected on steps of freestone. The pedestal and cap are of Boer War marble, and the Imperial Rouge shaft is of Carrara marble, surmounted with a lamp of burnished copper. The total cost of the memorial was £140. The Sydney Morning Herald, 21st of December 1904. Dedication. Dedicated on Monday the 19th of December 1904, the front inscription reads, "Names of soldiers who left Forbes for South Africa and lost their lives during the British Boer War, 1899 to 1902. Left side of the inscription, erected by the residents of Forbes in memory of the soldiers from this district who fought and fell for the Empire in South Africa during the British Boer War, 1899 to 1902. The back of the inscription reads, "Names of soldiers who left Forbes for South Africa and lost their lives during the British Boer War, 1899 to 1902. The right side inscription reads, "This memorial was unveiled by Colonel G.W. Waddell, VD, Acting District Commandant, on the 19th day of December 1904, R.E.B. Raymond, Mayor."